Welcome, welcome, welcome. Still, more than any other book from antiquity, if I could read any lost historical text conveniently translated into a language I could read, it has to be Death by Starvation, written by Hegesias of Cyrene. Well, okay, that is riveting, you are thinking, but who exactly is Hegesias of Cyrene? Well, Hegesias of Cyrene is a bit of a historical footnote, as we really don't know too much about him. But what we do know is Hegesias was a Cyrenaic philosopher active around 290 B.C.E, who also happened to teach in Alexandria, and his opinions were rather controversial, to say the least. Hegesias was given the nickname of Thanatos, meaning Death Persuader. He is most known for his exceptionally pessimistic worldview, which culminated in his most prominent work, Death by Starvation. In Death by Starvation, the premise is the main character plans to starve himself to death, arguing to a friend that death is inherently more desirable than life. The book essentially argues there is only two states, pleasure and pain. Ideally, you want to live only in pleasure. However, due to the fundamental flaws of the human character, it is impossible to live free from pain. He argues then the only way to avoid pain is to terminate the senses. But before I go on, it is important to note it has been lost to time why exactly he thought starvation would be the best way to achieve this aim. Certainly isn't quick, certainly isn't painless, and I feel there is a part of his overall philosophy that has been neglected by ancient historians who are more caught up in the sensationalism of his stories, and as a result the larger picture of his overall philosophy has probably been lost forever. So do keep in mind that whenever anyone is speaking about Hegesias of Cyrene, they are making assumptions based on incomplete texts, myself included. It is also worth noting that Hegesias, like so many supposed advocates of suicide, didn't appear to have killed himself, at least not during the years that he was at the height of his infamy. So again, I just want to state there is always the possibility there was more nuance to his philosophy than what has been recorded. Most of the source information comes from a couple of hundred years after the event, at which point you can never really be sure what is entirely accurate and what might be a sensationalist ancient Daily Mail-like character assassination. Most people seem to incorrectly label Hegesias as a nihilist, but I think this is unfair given the fact that he was a follower of Aristippus, with either Aristippus or Aristippus the Younger, his grandson, founding the Cyrenaic school of philosophy, which in itself argues the same, that there is only two states available, pleasure and pain. Therefore, the object of life is to live with more pleasure than pain, which is pretty close to Hegesias' fundamental philosophy, rather than just simply believing that all life is meaningless. Now, it is easy to say Hegesias is just a nihilistic, depressive version of hedonism, and that may or may not be true, but I personally believe Hegesias had merely accepted the concept of suffering as a fundamental part of human existence, be it through contact with Buddhist missionaries or simply through the realization that life is quite often painful, and therefore suffering must inherently be a part of the human experience. Although it is worth noting that Hegesias wasn't a pupil of Aristippus directly, with a link according to Diogenes Laertius in his book, Lives and Opinions of Eminent Philosophers, written roughly 300 years after the time of Hegesias, he states, "The disciples of Aristippus were his daughter Arete, Aetiops of Ptolemy, and Antipater of Cyrene. The pupils of Arete were Aristippus the Younger, that being the grandchild of the first Aristippus who went by the nickname of Mother Taught or Mother Pupil. His pupil would be Theodorus, known as the Atheist, and subsequently as God. Antipater's pupil would be Epimedes of Cyrene, his was Parabates, and his pupils would be Hegesias, the advocate of suicide, and Aniceris, who'd ransom Plato." He continues, "Those then who adhered to the teachings of Aristippus were known as Cyrenaics, and they held the following opinions. They laid down that there were only two states, pleasure and pain, the former a smooth, the latter a rough motion, and that pleasure does not differ from pleasure, nor is one pleasure more pleasant than another. One state is agreeable and the other is repellent to all living things." It goes on, "The school of Hegesias, it is called, adopted the same ends, namely pleasure and pain. In their view there is no such thing as gratitude or friendship or beneficence, because it is not for themselves that we choose to do these things, but simply from motives of interest, apart from which such conduct is nowhere found. They denied the possibility of happiness, for the body is infected with much suffering, while the soul shares in the sufferings of the body, and is prey to disturbance, and fortune often disappoints. From all this it follows that happiness cannot be realized, moreover life and death are each desirable in turn, but that there is anything naturally pleasant or unpleasant they deny, when some men are pleased and others pained by the same objects. This is owing to a lack of rarity or safit of such objects. Poverty and riches have no relevance to pleasure, neither for the rich nor the poor as such special share in pleasure. Slavery and freedom, nobility and low birth, honor and dishonor are alike indifferent in a calculation of pleasure. To the fool life is advantageous, while to the wise it is a matter of indifference. The wise man will be guided in all he does by his own interests, for there is no one whom he regards as equally deserving. I.e., be it rich or poor, we experience pleasure and pain the same. The state of pleasure is agreeable and desirable, and the state of pain is not. Therefore, it can be concluded that pleasure is the absence of pain, and that we're all egoistic, which is probably true. But the reason I put Diogenes' work after my own personal opinion is because as much as I really enjoyed Lives and Opinions of Eminent Philosophers, it is a bit like an ancient gossip magazine, mostly full of tidbits of information and a brief overview of their thoughts and ideas. It is generally considered an uncritical and unphilosophical compilation, and it is generally advised to take anything from that book with a grain of salt. Diogenes doesn't always cite his sources, and when he does, those sources have often been lost to time. A great example of this would be when I mentioned Anaxagoras, who ransomed Plato. That is the words written by Diogenes. In my research, though, I found that this cannot be true. He states Anaxagoras was a fellow student of Hegesias, but this is 50 years after Plato had already died, so it seems likely whoever Diogenes was sourcing from, it was mistaken. The ransom incident has been, in modern times, possibly attributed to a famous, celebrated charioteer also named Anaxagoras, who was written about by Elian. The Buddhist Connection, on the other hand, seems to come down from the fact that around the time of Hegesias' infamy, the governors of Cyrene, of Faceless, and later Magas, both claimed to have been recipients of Buddhist missionaries from the Indian king Ashoka. Just bear in mind, the Indian connection is mostly connecting the dots that might be there. It is entirely possible Hegesias came to these conclusions independently, and we, at a later date, have ascribed this to Buddhists in order to fill in a gap or two. Basically, as always, we won't know for sure until we dig more stuff up out the ground. As we've discovered, Hegesias argued that happiness is impossible to achieve and avoidance of pain and sorrow should be considered just as important. However, given that eventually pain and sorrow are inevitable no matter your ranking or tier in society, so therefore the only way to live without pain or sorrow was to commit suicide, as death was neither pain or pleasure but rather eternal termination of the senses. He argues that wealth and poverty have no influence at all on pleasure, and that the rich people are not affected by pleasure differently than poor people, which if you need a real world example for, you just have to look at Kurt Cobain, Robin Williams or Chester Bennington. Not that I'm endorsing Hegesias' worldviews, I'm just pointing out that this statement is true as it ever was. Money can't buy you happiness. Although admittedly I'd rather cry myself to sleep in a mansion than on a box next to a train platform. You could also say that Hegesias took the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism to its most radical conclusion. If he was in fact influenced by Buddhists, it could be argued that death by starvation was a way of transcending through the Four Noble Truths. The Four Noble Truths refer to and express the basic orientation of Buddhism, and in a short expression it is: we crave and cling to impermanent states and things, which are dukkha, incapable of satisfying and painful. This craving keeps us caught up in samsara, the endless cycle of repeated rebirth and dying, along with the dukkha that comes with it. There is, however, a way to end the cycle, namely by attaining nirvana, the cessation of craving, where after rebirth and the associated dukkha will no longer arise again. If we take the philosopher's approach to this, it's not hard to see how a man writing a book called Death by Starvation could have been attempting to express a philosophy such as the Four Noble Truths, albeit perhaps poorly. But again, all of this is conjecture, and the Buddhist Connection does seem to hinge on what a court would consider circumstantial evidence at best. But if true, it would help connect a few dots, but as for everything, until we dig up a cache of ancient Greek skulls from somewhere and get researchers in to look at them, it's quite possibly we'll never know all the facts surrounding this unusual footnote in history. But I digress. Death by starvation, regardless of its influence or intentions, would become quite controversial given the fact that 2,000 years ago, the people with the ability to write and have access to such work of literature, or even a mentorship of such an established teacher, would be a rarity. So what I'm saying is, this was controversial, probably mostly because of who it affected directly, rather than its ideas as a whole. Not entirely, of course, but it was definitely a part of it. As according to Cicero, around 300 years later, death by starvation led to repercussions for Hegesias both personally and professionally. The high number of suicides in particular among his students caused panic throughout the city, and as a result, Hegesias would be permanently banned from teaching in Alexandria. As alluded to previously, education at this level was only for the upper echelons of society. This was the children of the top tier of ancient Greek society, and this top tier was outraged that their children and heirs had resorted to suicide after reading the works of their teacher. Hegesias may even have the dubious honour of being the first teacher to ever be censored by a government when he was banned from teaching in Alexandria as a result of the suicides. Okay, how very depressing. But why is this footnote in history important? Well, because I don't think the point of death by starvation was to cause suicide among its readers. Although that is conjecture, as so much has been lost to history, it is impossible to say anything concrete about the subject. I think it's an important footnote because it helps highlight that no matter how you're feeling, there will always have been someone who has felt that way before. Not that I condone or endorse taking such actions, as I feel like death is inevitable anyway, so there's no real point in accelerating the process. But I do find it fascinating that people so long ago were writing and teaching about such subjects. It is a bit of a heavy one for the soul to sit and question your own mortality, but hopefully that realization, if nothing else, will give you the push needed to start planning, rather than praying, for whatever it is that you would like to do with your life.